Hey everyone, Zoe here, and I wanted to make a tutorial to replicate the old InputManager's GetKey or GetButton functionality with the new input system package. I've seen a lot of people who want a single, simple statement that they can use in order to return a Boolean for whether or not an input is pressed on your update or fixed update methods, so that they can adapt their old projects that were using the Input Manager more easily. This isn't the only way to do this, but I believe that it's the simplest way to replicate the functionality of the old system, changing as little of your code as possible, and as easy as possible to understand for people who are familiar with the old Input Manager. So what we have here is a demo project in which there's a cube that spins whenever we're pressing the space key, but only when the key is held down. So we hold space key, it spins, we release it, it stops, hold it, it spins, release it, it stops. There's a cube spin script which is attached to the cube, and if we open that up, we're doing Input.GetButton for the jump button, and we're setting that to a Boolean called isSpinning, checking is spinning, and then we apply the rotation if isSpinning is true. Very, very simple. And basically, we're going to replicate this GetButton function within the new input system as simply as possible so that you need to write as few new lines of code as possible and can basically just paste the line in wherever you have that in your code. It's designed to be easy and adaptable. So now if we go back into Unity, I've started installing the new input system. There was a cut there you might not have seen. So basically in your package manager, when you install input system, it's going to ask you, you're using the old input manager and that's going to change some stuff. So you have to hit yes. That'll disable the old input system and it's going to restart your editor. So let's give that a moment. You want to save the changes? Yeah. So Unity stops, then it launches back up. Hopefully it launches quickly. Yeah, any second now. There we go. So now we're back into the project, but we can no longer use Input.GetButton jump. So what do? Well, we have to create a new input actions object, and we're going to call it controls just to be simple. We open up controls, and we can dock that. I like to dock it just in my main view here. Generate the C# class, hit apply. I'm assuming that people will at least have a basic familiarity with the new input system, so this should all be known. But we're going to create a new action map and call it cube. We're going to create one new action on here, or I'll just delete the original action and create an action called spin. The action type is going to be a value, and the value is going to be analog. And then on the path, we're going to make it space on the keyboard. So now we have a action map called cube that has an action called spin, and spin is an analog value that is set to space on the keyboard. It's really important that you make it a value because that's how we're going to be reading it every frame. So if we go back into our code, we need to create a reference. Oh, actually, we need to save the asset first so that there's something to reference. And we need to make sure that we have the using statement for the input system in here so that we can access it. And then we're going to declare a private controls and just call it controls. Now, in our awake method, what we're going to do is have controls equals new controls. So we've got a constructor for controls there that's going to initialize a new one. So now we can access anything that's within controls. And that's actually all that we need to add outside of just changing the Input.GetButton. In other ways of doing this, you might have to declare a bunch of events for when, controls.cube.spin is performed and when the key is released. But what we're trying to do is minimize that. We'd really just want to replace this line Input.GetButton jump. Okay, well, there's two other things that we have to add just for housekeeping. An onEnable function. So onEnable, we have controls.enable. And then on disable, we have controls.disable, which, yeah, we just need that there for housekeeping. So what are we going to replace this with now? Well, we are going to replace it with controls.cube.spin.readValue, which is going to be a float. And we're going to have it greater than 0. And that's it. So I'm just going to quickly hop into here and show you that it works. As long as I didn't forget anything, as I am wont to do. So we go back into here, and it's the exact same as before. So why does that work as a Boolean? I'm sure anyone who's familiar with conditions and just basic coding knows, but just to be really clear, what we're doing is we're reading a value from a float. So what this does when we turn the spin action into a value and make it an analog is this becomes a float. So whenever I'm pressing it, its value is set to 1. Whenever I'm not pressing it, its value is set to 0. So in the condition here, when I set it to read value as a float greater than 0, we're just checking to make sure that it's set to 1. And if it's set to 1, we know that the key is pressed. And if it's not, then it's not. Also worth noting is that because it's an analog, if you set this to something like a trigger, which doesn't necessarily have to just be 0 or 1, that can be partially pressed, if the trigger is partially pressed, it'll return a value between 0 and 1. Now in this case, we're just checking that it's greater than 0. So this is going to return true as long as it's greater than 0. So any degree that you're pressing it, even if it's only very slightly feathering it, it's going to be higher than 0. You can use this, for example, if you wanted to have a certain threshold on a trigger, it only returns true if the trigger is half pressed. You could have it as greater than 0.5. So you do have a little bit of nuance, but this is basically just to see whether or not that action is reading input at the moment.